Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing with her favorite teddy bear, Mr. Dinosaur, when his button eyes seemed to follow her every move. She shook her head, thinking it was just her imagination. But then, a low growl rumbled from within the stuffed toy, and his fabric mouth stretched into a wide, toothy grin. Mr. Dinosaur, usually so cuddly, now felt cold and stiff in her arms. His stuffing seemed to shift and writhe, as if something was moving beneath the surface. Peppa dropped him, and he landed with an unnatural thud, his button eyes still fixed on her. The room grew dark, even though the sun was still shining outside. The shadows in the corners of her bedroom deepened, and the familiar toys on her shelf seemed to lean in, their plastic eyes glinting with a sinister light. Mr. Dinosaur began to twitch, then to crawl, slowly dragging himself across the carpet towards her. His growl intensified, becoming a guttural snarl. Peppa backed away, her heart pounding. The once comforting presence of her beloved toy had transformed into a terrifying predator. The air grew heavy, and the scent of dust and old fabric filled the room, mixed with something else, something foul and ancient. The other toys on the shelf began to whisper, their voices a cacophony of distorted sounds, urging Mr. Dinosaur on. The room felt smaller, closing in on her. Mr. Dinosaur lunged, his fabric mouth snapping open to reveal rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Peppa screamed, but no sound came out. The room was filled with the terrifying presence of her once beloved toy, now a monstrous hunter. The familiar comfort of her bedroom had become a hunting ground, and she was the prey. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was trying to fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, but the water wouldn't stop. It started as a drip, then a steady stream, and now a torrent, filling the sink and overflowing onto the floor. The water wasn't clear. It was murky and black, swirling with an unnatural current. Strange, iridescent bubbles rose to the surface, popping with a faint, unsettling hiss. Peppa and George watched, mesmerized and a little frightened, as the black water spread across the kitchen tiles, seeping under the cupboards and around the base of the refrigerator. The air grew heavy with the smell of stagnant water and something else, something ancient and metallic. The reflection in the growing puddle on the floor wasn't their kitchen. It was a distorted, shadowy realm, with skeletal trees and a sky the color of bruised plums. Daddy Pig, usually so confident, looked bewildered, his tools floating uselessly in the rising tide. The black water began to churn, and from its depths, faint, glowing eyes emerged, blinking slowly. They were not the eyes of fish, but something far older, far more sinister. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and laughter, was transforming into a dark, watery abyss. The sound of the rushing water filled their ears, drowning out all other sounds. The glowing eyes multiplied, surrounding them, their silent gaze chilling Peppa to the bone. The water level rose, slowly but inexorably, threatening to engulf them. The familiar kitchen table now looked like a small island in a vast, dark ocean. The black water pulsed with a faint, internal light, revealing glimpses of strange, elongated forms swimming beneath the surface. The house was being consumed, not by fire, but by a creeping liquid darkness. The glowing eyes drew closer, their silent presence a terrifying promise of what lay beneath the surface. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when Peppa noticed that the colors in her house were slowly draining away. Started with small things. The red apples in the kitchen bowl looked a little less bright than usual. The purple sofa in the living room seemed to have faded slightly, as if it had been left in the sun too long. At first, Peppa thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but as the hours passed, the effect became more obvious. The yellow walls were turning pale, like butter left out in the cold. The green carpet was becoming gray around the edges, as if the color was being sucked out from underneath. Mummy Pig was cooking dinner, but she didn't seem to notice that her orange dress was slowly turning white. The vegetables she was chopping were losing their vibrant colors one by one. The carrots went from bright orange to pale yellow to almost transparent. The green peas faded to gray, then to a sickly white. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, but the black ink was becoming lighter and lighter until the words were barely visible on the increasingly gray paper. His red shirt was turning pink, then pale pink, then almost white. Even his pink skin was becoming paler, as if he was slowly turning into a ghost. George was playing with his colorful blocks, but they were all turning the same dull gray color. His beloved dinosaur toy, once bright green, was now the color of old concrete. George himself seemed unaware that his blue shirt was fading to white, and his rosy cheeks were becoming as pale as paper. The most frightening part was that as the colors drained away, her family seemed to be losing their personalities too. Mummy Pig's cheerful humming became quieter and more monotone. Daddy Pig's hearty laughter turned into a weak chuckle, then into silence. George's excited dinosaur noises became whispers, then stopped altogether. Peppa ran to her bedroom and looked in the mirror. Her own reflection was losing color too. Her pink dress was turning white. Her rosy cheeks were becoming pale, and even her eyes seemed to be losing their sparkle. She watched in horror as her reflection became more and more like a black and white photograph. When she looked out her bedroom window, she saw that the entire world was being drained of color. The green trees were turning gray. The blue sky was becoming white, and even the sun looked like a pale circle of light with no warmth or brightness. The house felt colder as the colors disappeared. Without the warm yellows and cheerful reds, everything seemed lifeless and empty. The familiar rooms became strange and unwelcoming, like walking through a world made of shadows and fog. By evening, almost everything had turned gray or white. The family sat around the dinner table eating colorless food in silence. They moved slowly, as if the absence of color had drained their energy along with their appearance. Their faces were expressionless, their voices barely audible whispers. Peppa tried to remember what colors looked like, but the memories were fading too. She could barely recall what red was supposed to be, or how green had made her feel happy. The world was becoming a place where color had never existed, where everything had always been shades of gray and white. The episode ended with Peppa lying in her now white bed, looking up at a ceiling that had once been painted with cheerful pink flowers, but was now just pale shapes against a colorless background. As she closed her eyes, she wondered if she would wake up in a world where color was just a dream she had once had, or if the grayness would continue to spread until even her dreams became as empty and lifeless as everything else around her. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was the middle of the night when Peppa woke up to the sound of someone cooking in the kitchen. She could hear the familiar sounds of pots and pans, the sizzling of food, and the gentle humming that Mummy Pig always did while preparing meals. But it was 3 in the morning, and everyone should have been asleep. Peppa crept downstairs to investigate and found Mummy Pig standing at the stove, cooking what looked like breakfast. But when Peppa looked closer, she realized that Mummy Pig was making the same breakfast over and over again. She would crack an egg, cook it, put it on a plate, then immediately throw it away and start again. Daddy Pig was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a newspaper in the dark. The newspaper was blank, but he turned the pages anyway, making satisfied grunting sounds as if he was reading the most interesting stories. His eyes never moved, and he never looked up, even when Peppa spoke to him. George was in the living room, playing with his blocks in the darkness, but he wasn't building anything. He would stack 3 blocks, knock them down, stack them again, knock them down. In an endless cycle, his movements were mechanical and precise, like a toy that had been wound up. Peppa tried to turn on the lights, but they wouldn't work. The house remained in a strange twilight, dark enough that she could barely see. but light enough that she could make out the shapes of her family going through their nighttime routines that made no sense. When she looked out the window, she saw that all the houses on their street were glowing with the same dim light. In every window, she could see families doing strange things in the darkness. One family was having dinner at their coffee table. Another family was watching television that showed only static. Children were playing with toys that didn't make any sound. Peppa realized that time had stopped working properly in their house. The clock on the wall showed 3:17, but the hands never moved. When she looked at her watch, it showed a different time entirely, and the numbers seemed to be changing randomly rather than counting forward. She tried to go back to bed, but when she reached her room, she found another Peppa already sleeping there. The sleeping Peppa looked exactly like her, but when she breathed, no air moved in or out. Her chest rose and fell, but it was just motion without purpose. Like everything else in the house, the bathroom mirror showed her reflection, but the reflection was doing things she wasn't doing. While Peppa stood still, her reflection brushed its teeth. While Peppa brushed her teeth, her reflection combed its hair. They were always one step out of sync, like a dance where one partner was always behind. As the night continued, Peppa discovered that she was the only one in the house who was still real. Her family had become like mechanical dolls, going through the motions of living without any awareness or purpose. They responded to her voice with appropriate sounds, but their words were just recordings playing at the right moments. The episode ended with Peppa sitting on the stairs, watching her family perform their meaningless midnight routines. She wondered if this was what happened every night after she fell asleep, or if tonight was different. As dawn approached, she saw the first hint of real sunlight through the windows, and slowly, one by one, her family members stopped their strange activities and returned to their beds, leaving her alone with the memory of a night when she was the only living thing in a house full of beautiful, empty puppets. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a rainy Saturday morning at the Pig family house. Peppa was playing in her room when she heard Mummy Pig calling her for breakfast. But when she came downstairs, the kitchen was empty. The table was set with 4 plates, but the food on them looked exactly the same as yesterday. And the day before that, Daddy Pig was sitting in his usual chair reading the newspaper. But the pages were blank. He turned them anyway, making the same rustling sound over and over. When Peppa tried to speak to him, he looked up and smiled, but his smile was too wide and stayed frozen on his face for too long. George was in the living room playing with his blocks, but he was building the same tower repeatedly. Every time he finished, the blocks would tumble down by themselves, and George would start again without showing any emotion. His movements were precise and mechanical, like a wind-up toy. Peppa noticed that the rain outside wasn't normal. The drops on the windows moved upward instead of down, and they formed strange patterns that looked like faces. The faces seemed to be watching the family through the glass, their expressions changing from curious to concerned to frightened. The house felt different today. The stairs creaked in a musical pattern, playing the same tune every time someone walked on them. The doors opened and closed by themselves, always at the exact same moments. Even the clock on the wall ticked in an unusual rhythm, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but never normal. When Peppa looked in the bathroom mirror, she saw herself, but her reflection was doing things she wasn't doing. The reflection waved when Peppa stood still, and smiled when Peppa frowned. Gradually, the reflection began to move several seconds before Peppa did, as if it knew what she was going to do next. The telephone rang, but when Peppa answered it, she heard her own voice on the other end, having a conversation she didn't remember having. The voice was talking about things that hadn't happened yet, describing a day that seemed to be tomorrow, or maybe yesterday. As the day went on, Peppa realized that everything in the house was repeating in loops, but the loops were getting shorter. First, conversations repeated every hour, then every 30 minutes, then every 15 minutes. The family was trapped in smaller and smaller cycles of the same actions and words. By evening, the loops had become so short that Peppa could predict exactly what everyone would say and do. She tried to break the pattern by doing something different, but found that she couldn't. Her body moved on its own, following the same script as everyone else. The episode ended with Peppa sitting at the dinner table, eating the same meal for what felt like the 100th time, while outside the upward falling rain continued to form watching faces on the windows and inside the house. The pig family performed their daily routine in an endless, shrinking loop of time. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was bedtime at the pig family house. Peppa was getting ready for sleep when she noticed something strange about her bedroom. The toys on her shelf had moved during the day, and now they were all facing her bed with their plastic eyes wide open. George was already asleep in his room, but his dinosaur toy was making quiet clicking sounds even though no one was playing with it. The sound echoed through the hallway, like tiny footsteps walking back and forth. Mummy Pig called from downstairs, but her voice sounded different tonight. It was too cheerful, too perfect, like a recording played over and over again. When Peppa looked down the stairs, she could see Mummy Pig in the kitchen, but she wasn't moving naturally. Her actions repeated in the same pattern every few seconds. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room, but the pages never turned. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the same spot, blinking in a mechanical rhythm that didn't seem human. The house felt wrong. The familiar yellow walls seemed to pulse gently, as if they were breathing. The purple sofa in the living room had grown darker, and the television showed only static with strange shadows moving inside the gray noise. Peppa tried to call out to her family, but when she spoke, her voice echoed back from the walls in a way that made it sound like someone else was speaking. The echo came a few seconds too late, as if the house was learning to copy her voice. As she walked back to her bedroom, Peppa noticed that the hallway was longer than it should be. New doors had appeared along the walls, all slightly open, revealing rooms that shouldn't exist. Inside these rooms, she could see more families just like hers, but they moved like puppets, performing the same actions endlessly. When Peppa finally reached her bed, she looked out the window and saw rows of identical houses stretching into the darkness. In every window, she could see herself looking back, but these other Peppas moved just a moment after she did, like reflections that couldn't keep up. The episode ended with Peppa closing her eyes, hoping that when she woke up, everything would return to normal. But as she drifted off to sleep, she could hear her own voice whispering from somewhere else in the house, saying the same goodnight words she had just thought to herself. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa had always been afraid of her bedroom closet, but tonight her fear felt justified. The closet door, which she always kept firmly closed, was standing slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see movement in the darkness beyond. At first, she thought it might be her clothes swaying in a breeze, but there was no wind in her room, and the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful. As she watched, small hands appeared at the edge of the door, pushing it open wider. The hands were pale and thin, with fingers that seemed too long for a child. More hands appeared, then arms, then faces that looked almost like children she knew, but with features that were slightly wrong: eyes too large, smiles too wide, skin too pale. The closet children began to emerge one by one, moving with silent, gliding steps that made no sound on the wooden floor. They arranged themselves around her bed in a perfect circle, all facing her with those unnaturally large eyes. Peppa tried to call for her parents, but no sound came from her throat. The closet children began to whisper in unison, their voices creating a sound like wind through dead leaves. They were speaking her name, but pronouncing it wrong, stretching the syllables until it became something alien and frightening. As they whispered, they began to reach toward her with those impossibly long fingers, their movements slow and hypnotic. Peppa realized that the children looked familiar because they were versions of all her friends from school, but changed, corrupted, made wrong. The closest child, who looked like a twisted version of Susie Sheep, opened its mouth to speak, and instead of words, a sound like static filled the room. One by one, the other children opened their mouths, adding to the static until the sound became overwhelming, drowning out everything else in a wave of white noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once.